So welcome everyone to another week of the 2023 Summer Chem Lab Speaker Series. My name is Dr. Andy Kim, assistant professor here in the Department of Anthropology at UC Berkeley, and it is my honor to introduce and recommend Dr. Mallika Sarma. Dr. Sarma completed her PhD in anthropology at the University of Notre Dame. Her work focuses on biobehavioral adaptations to extreme environments, and her projects include assessing stress response, neurovestibular adaptation, and integrated multisystem physiology, with applications to clinical settings and the spaceflight environment, which we'll hear a lot about today. She is the incoming director of the Health and Biobehavioral Lab and assistant professor in the Department of Anthropology at the University of Pennsylvania, which will begin in fall of 2024. How exciting. So please help me welcoming Dr. Sarma. Okay, cool. So we'll go ahead and turn it over. So
awesome.
Let me see. Can you share your screen? Are you able to do that?
Yeah, let me.
Oh, you're sharing screen already. Oh my God, obviously. Okay, cool. Go ahead.
You can see the big screen and not the note screen.
Everything's ready to go.
Perfect. Awesome. Thank you all so much for being here and for having me. I am very excited to be part of this summer series and be following some really fantastic talks here. Just some really quick housekeeping troubleshooting. I know that we've all been living in this world of Zoom, but it's always different and chaotic every single time. I am attempting to give this talk on one screen. This is the first time in a very long time that I've tried to give a Zoom talk on a single screen and not with multiple screens. And so if for whatever reason there's any hiccups and like you suddenly can't see my screen anymore, or you can't hear me or see me, just holler. I also can't see anything in the chat. So I'm going to rely on Dr. Kim here or anyone who is brave enough to say things out loud, to ask me questions. If you have questions in between the talk, I'm totally down to talk in between. I am going to try and keep this as light and fun and casual as possible, since we are doing a pretty heavy theory talk today. So I'm here to talk about human biology perspectives on human spaceflight. So let's talk about humans in space. Now, this right here is the future. Imagine it's the year 2045 and we have humans on Mars. Now, it's not a fantasy, it's not a science fiction. This is actually an inevitability. Today in 2023, we already have the wheels in motion. Artemis 1, which is the first of many Artemis missions to bring back a human presence to the moon and serve as an upcoming gateway for upcoming Mars missions, it has already launched. The biggest challenge to interplanetary habitation, however, is not actually an engineering problem, but a human problem. We know that our species have taken millennia to adapt to the many different environments here on Earth. But when we're thinking about trying to keep a group of humans alive outside the safe confines of our planet, it's pretty complex. Now, a clear understanding of how humans will acclimate and adapt to stressors of spaceflight and other celestial bodies can really only be fully known once we arrive, which quite honestly is terrifying. Now, there are lots of different ways to answer the question of how are humans able to be in these kinds of spaces. Now, as my training in biological anthropology and human biology specifically, I'm considering looking at human acclimatization and adaptation, where we're talking from either the short term or all the way through generations. And how do evolutionary processes shape what might be happening to human bodies in an unknown space? So the big question that I'm interested in here is, how do humans survive and thrive in extreme environments? And we'll get back to this question, but let's give a quick outline of all the different things we'll be talking about today in our 40 to 60 minute session. First, we want to talk about thinking about human biology at the extremes, current perspectives in human spaceflight research, then what we can think about as our human spaceflight future, and then finally a Q&A. And I'm hoping that we'll have tons of time for a Q&A because that's always the best part. Now, I had kind of given this warning ahead of time. I remember in graduate school talking why do we care about theory? Why should we even like bother with it? It's just annoying thoughts that are in people's heads. But hopefully by the end of this talk, I can convince all of you that with a perspective shift in theory and the existing frameworks that we work in for looking at human spaceflight, we can actually take this work that's impacting real human bodies and behavior and do what we can to make it better. So Dr. Kim had already given a pretty good background of, my pedigree, where I'm coming from, but I do think it's an important way to talk about like the perspectives that I come from and the trajectory that I've had. So I got my bachelor's in science in both evolutionary anthropology and psychology at the University of Michigan, and then later my PhD at Notre Dame, where I focused on adaptation and acclimation to extreme environments with a specific focus on neuroendocrine and energetic and metabolic systems. I see some of my really fantastic colleagues in the audience, so thank you for coming and hearing this talk for the millionth time. And right now, I am currently at the Johns Hopkins School of Medicine and working with the Translational Research Institute for Space Health. They're currently funding my postdoc. And my work is focusing on vestibular adaptation and stress response as related to spaceflight settings. So I've had the opportunity to take this pretty hardcore anthropological background and translate it to a clinical setting where we are actively working and tying together clinical and spaceflight work. So when working in austere settings, being an extreme environment researcher like myself, capturing any kind of data, let alone behavioral and importantly, cost-effective physiological data can be very, very difficult. There's a lot of MacGyvering that happens. You have to do a lot of out-of-the-box thinking. You have limited resources. And this can really make or break your research in these settings. And this honestly has shaped a lot of my own thinking about working in spaceflight, because it turns out that working in extreme environments on Earth and working in a spaceflight setting are actually not that different. So to integrate rigorous human biology methodology in the field and then back to the lab, my work has often used a mixed methods approach. And so using a suite of minimally invasive biomarkers, including saliva, fingernail samplings for hormones, red blood spots, wearable technology, like ectographs or empaticas, which are all like wearable watches and monitors, as well as behavioral observation methods, standardized surveys, including psychometrics, in-depth interviews, and participant observation. So I like to think of my research methodological toolkit as everything but the kitchen sink. And I find that that turns out to work really, really well in extreme settings. So, okay, let's get back to this main question. When we're talking about how do humans survive and thrive in extreme environments, what exactly are we asking here? So let's start with what is an extreme environment? Now, here, for the purposes of this talk, I define it as somewhere that has highly intensive environmentally or lifestyle-driven stressors that pose substantial challenges to the human body. Now, we can think of these environments as those with high degrees of either harshness or unpredictability. So unpredictability is the spatial temporal variability in harshness. Now, this idea, and I'm seeing that my harshness and unpredictability little tags have disappeared, but imagine they're still there. Now, this idea comes out of life history theory, and we'll be talking more about life history theory in a bit. Now, scholars such as Bruce Ellis, Jay Belsky, anthropologists like Chris Kozawa, Anita Thayer, and others have discussed how harshness and unpredictability in an environment are fundamental to shaping an individual. Now, in the behavioral ecology world, there's a lot of debate on the mechanisms. There's some really fantastic baboon research that's been done by Susan Alberts and co. But here, I think it's helpful to think about it as a heuristic to categorize environments and conceptually identify what kinds of environments exist where humans would have to be highly dependent on one another. In developmental contexts, there is often this focus on psychosocial stressors. So you often read about harshness and unpredictability in the developmental plasticity literature. So when you're thinking about babies and how are babies responding to their environments and how they're growing across the life course, you see it in parental care. But in this model of extremes, I want to take it one step further. We are seeing the psychosocial stressors of an extreme going hand in hand with an environmental stressor, particularly in this extreme environment, and they're always going to be working together. Now, survive and thrive, I feel like I always get flack when I talk about surviving and thriving. It feels very buzzwordy, but what I think is important to take note here, and what we care about, is how bodies are adjusting to their environments to stay alive, so surviving. But we're looking beyond the basic process of biological processes of physiological homeostasis, and we want to think about what goes beyond that. So positive growth, emergent properties, resilience. That's like the hot topic of, like, since we've been living in this COVID world. What happens when things actually go better than expected? What happens when things don't break and they don't fall apart? When are people happy and they're doing well? How is that then related to their bodies? Now, as anthropologists, that's something that, we understand goes hand in hand with just everyday function, but in clinical settings, and particularly in operational exercise physiological settings, it's harder to define. And like, what are the metrics we're specifically looking at, understanding what surviving and thriving really are. Now, the final thing is humans, plural. Now, with my training as a biological anthropologist and human biologist, I consider the evolutionary frameworks that make human bodies the way that they are. So again, it is very rare to find a human in any environment, let alone extreme or not, by themselves, which is why it's important to study humans as members, groups. And we also know that groups make things more complicated, and there are costs and benefits to being with other people. Now, I will come back to the plurality of being human and the importance of human groups and human social structures towards the end of the talk. So if we want to talk about humans in space or on moons or other planets, we first need to understand the capacity and the ways in which humans can adapt. So we know that here on Earth, humans have successfully survived for extended periods of time over several generations in a range of environments and ecosystems. I'm not going to get into all of them specifically, but we know that they've survived in these spaces and many times thrived in these spaces at varying levels of success. And if you're interested, just a quick plug, some fantastic colleagues and I just published a really fantastic mini review on these extreme environment adaptations that came out last week, that just touches on, how humans have survived in these spaces and how biological anthropology provides a more holistic perspective that can maybe inform extreme physiology as well. So across these environments, what is important to note is that the ways in which people survive, whether through short-term rapid acclimatization or longer-term adaptation, they all have these three overarching characteristics. One is that these changes are multifaceted. You're not seeing just one single change to a cardiovascular system, or to one cardiovascular cell, or like a T cell change. You're seeing things that are happening multifold. You're also seeing things that are happening over different timescales. What is happening within the 5 minutes of exposure is very different from what might be happening after a year or what may be happening after a couple of years. And then finally, looking at the specific environmental and social context. So when we're thinking about social context here, we're thinking about the general social, economic, political milieu in which all of us humans, who are an extremely social primate, all exist within. So all of these factors are just as relevant in a spaceflight context as they are in other extreme environments. And so if we're considering extremes at various degrees of environmental risk, where ecological and social shifts at varying degrees of harshness and unpredictability shape everyday outcome and function. So it doesn't matter if it's happening at high altitude or circumpolar regions or environments with high parasitic and pathogenic loads, or spaceflight. What we know is that these characteristics have become particularly important when thinking about the things that we know and that we have a handle on, and things that we don't know, the unknowns about what is actually happening to the human body in any of these environments. And this becomes particularly important in a spaceflight environment, with many of the decisions have to be made ahead of time. So, okay, let's just hammer home this harshness unpredictability matrix. If we're considering other extreme regions, we can categorize them on this matrix. So high altitude, for example, we're seeing high levels of harshness, high levels of unpredictability. In foraging populations, which oftentimes isn't thought of a extreme setting because of the resource abundance that is oftentimes there. High harshness and cyclical unpredictability. And then, of course, the spaceflight environment, we're seeing high to low harshness, because it really depends on what kind of spaceflight environment you're in, which we'll talk about in just a few slides. But high levels of unpredictability, and high levels of unpredictability oftentimes because we've just never been there before. So we don't actually know what is possible to predict. And then, of course, climate change, you can't forget about our climate impacted present, where there's high harshness, high unpredictability. So if we're getting back here to our big question, conceptually, there are lots of different ways how we can think about the human body in an extreme environment. If we're thinking about evolutionary implications of adaptation and acclimatization in extremes, one tool that we can use is life history theory. Okay, so let's break this down. First, we have here an individual. And for those of you who have attended several of my talks, you know, this my little stick figure here follows me throughout my talks and is a fantastic demonstrator of all of the different concepts we want to talk about. But this individual here has various physiological and behavioral systems that are all interconnected and act on one another. And when you place the individual in any environment, so let's talk about the energetically demanding high altitude environment, there are a series of potent stressors that the body needs to respond to. Now, responding to these stressors costs something on the human body. So what we care about here is energy. Energy translates, it is the currency of life. Now, I definitely think I'm dating myself or any of the undergraduates who might be attending this talk, but in the immortal words of the Wu-Tang Clan, cash rules everything around me. Now, cash in this case is our energy budget, and we're talking about human functioning across a lifespan. So how we're balancing our currency and our energy, and how it's going to be balanced between growth, reproduction, and maintenance. Now, these trade-offs are happening at every single moment over the course of an individual's life. And so when a stressor is appearing that needs to be addressed, your body is then figuring out how to allocate these resources to best manage this energy over time. Now, in an extreme environment, the decisions that are being made at any given point are going to have long-term impacts. And if you're not able to prepare adequately for that, you're going to be in big trouble. So this is another picture that I really like to include in my talks because it's just bonkers. It's so cool and so crazy. There's a tiny speck on here that if I was in person, I'd be able to kind of point to. But this picture right here is Earth. Now, this picture was taken by by one of the rovers. Maybe Perseverance, maybe Curiosity. I actually don't remember which rover it was, but a rover, a little tiny robot on a different planet, took a picture of Earth from Mars, and it's just really, really far away, really crazy to think about. But I also feel like it's a good way of talking about how far away it feels to fully understand of like the complexity of what is about to happen to us as a human species, what's going to happen as we become a multi-planetary species, what does that mean? Just the intellectual and like emotional acceptance that we are going to be so far away from home and all of the things that it can do. Where we're at right now, from our own understanding of science, humans and how they're responding to their environments and how they're balancing trade-offs across a lifespan is really complicated. So when we're thinking about humans on a whole different planet, where is even the best place to start? So we know for sure that when we see humans in space, there are structural and functional changes to the brain, there are changes to your cardiovascular system, there are changes to bone and muscle, changes to GI function. These are things that you see in the headlines, New York Times, Washington Post, with Science Direct, when there's a new launch and people are coming back. Strange things happen when humans are coming back from space. But if we think about it, go back a little bit, thinking about it more holistically, we think of our little person right here who's has their interconnected physiological systems, and you put them in a spaceflight environment. Now, the environment I have them in here right now is the inside of the International Space Station, which is very stressful for those of you who like minimalist aesthetic. But you need all of those wires, you need all of those different modules. Thinking about how an individual over a lifetime is going to be balancing growth, maintenance, and reproduction, and the the allocation decisions that are being made during that stint in spaceflight is really completely unknown. In fact, there's so many big, important questions that we just don't actually have an answer to. So things like, what are the specific nutritional requirements? How much of that resource weight are you allowed to have on board? Is it possible to even have a full gestation, a human gestation? What is juvenile human development going to look like? What about longer term immune function? There are tons of questions. So how do we contend with this very complicated problem? You're integrating biology, medical risk, and engineering. Now, the argument that's being made by a group of scholars who work in the spaceflight world and some people who are outside of that as well is the importance of systems medicine and the taking a systems approach, or the interaction of multiple systems at different time scales and different time points. Now, arguably, this is something that anthropologists, we already have the toolkit to do, and it's something we already look at by looking at using evolutionary and human biology, other human biology perspectives. Okay, so let's just talk about what we actually know about what happens to humans in space. For those of you who are space people, and this is like old hat to you that enjoy the review, for those of you who are new, get buckled up because there's a lot of weird things that happen to human bodies in space. Now, I just want to do a quick caveat. This is very brief. Like I could do maybe an entire class, several classes on all the different things that happen to human bodies in space. It's not by any means exhaustive, kind of like a, best hits, but it's just an overview. Now, we are really fortunate to have several decades worth of data of human response to spaceflight, but with limited subjects, costs, and difficulty, there's still a tremendous amount of research to be done. So, I try to say this in most of the spaceflight talks that I give, particularly to those who are working in the human biology fields, psychobiology, fields that are not specific to spaceflight, please, there's so much work to be done. So if you want to make the switch and you want to start doing spaceflight work, I will send you my email and we will talk and we will get you part of it, because there's a lot of opportunity there. Now, one other quick thing, which I think is really cool, and I like to mention whenever I'm teaching, is for anyone in the audience who was born after the year 2000, born in 2000 or any time after, you have always lived with a continuous human spaceflight presence on the International Space Station, which is just very, very cool. Okay, so let's talk about what actually happens to the human body. So NASA has a segment called the Human Research Program, and they are in charge of all of the human research that happens that's funded by NASA. And they also conveniently currently fund my work through the Translational Research Institute for Space Health, but they define 5 specific hazards. So I just want to say the images, this really great floating astronaut lady is from Washington Post. There's a great article out there that talks about how space destroys your body. If I don't know if they were trying to get people not to go. It's a great article though. And then the little tiny images are all from NASA. Okay, so first thing we have is altered gravity, so shifting gravity fields. So on Earth, we have a chronic load that helps maintain the integrity of our many body systems. So every day when you wake up in the morning and you get yourself out of bed and you walk outside of your bed and you're walking around drinking water, brushing your teeth, whatever, you are doing exercise, because you have a chronic load of gravity that is constantly pulling your body down. And so just walking, just lifting your hand, doing whatever, is you are creating force loads that is protecting your bone health, it's protecting your muscle health, and that is what human bodies have adapted to. Now, the different altered gravity environments that are involved in spaceflight are many. So it's not just one kind of altered gravity environment, there are actually several different kinds. So we have the weightlessness in a spacecraft or in a spacesuit if you're doing an extracurricular or extravehicular activity or an EVA. There are gravity levels that are on the local celestial bodies, like the Earth's moon, for example, has 1/6 of Earth's gravity. Actually, the Apollo 11 launch, I think, is this week, the anniversary of the launch. So I'm sure you'll see lots of YouTube videos on Instagram or Twitter of, astronauts at Apollo 11 landing, bounding up and down. And Mars is 1/3 of Earth's gravity. But there are also transitions between these different gravitational fields. So acceleration and deceleration can be up to 3 to 6 Gs, which is a lot of force on a body. So if you have been on a roller coaster and have been going down really fast on a roller coaster and you feel that crushing pressure, that is something like that, but imagine that like times 100. Now, these different gravitational fields and transition forces subject biological systems to stress. So this includes cellular and molecular adaptations and changes to the genome, to the epigenome, as well as the proteome, and these changes create risks for a range of different pathologies. It has impacts on spatial orientation, on hand-eye coordination, bone and muscle loading, and subsequent bone remodeling, balance, and locomotion. Weightlessness can lead to cephalic fluid shifts, which impact cardiovascular function and brain structures. So I included these because I feel like that they are a huge hit, but these are the scariest, weirdest GIFs that exist on the internet. So looking at fluid shifts on Earth. So if you look on the figure on the left, that's like a normal fluid movement on Earth in 1G. But then when you go into a microgravity, you don't have gravity pulling down on you anymore. So you're having more fluid that's going up into your head and into your arms. And it makes your head and your face really puffy. It makes you feel like you have like really bloated fingers and hands. They have like the chicken leg syndrome where like your legs get really skinny because you don't have any fluid happening there, which is why they have you wear compression pants. They have the Russian group has a very interesting like compression pant situation that like automatically compresses your pants. Your heart, your cardiovascular system it's very clearly impacted because of all the fluid shift, but your heart can literally change shape from being like, heart shaped to being almost globular because you have so much fluid moving in there. Now, you also have fluid shifts that are moving towards the head that are causing intracranial pressure. So one of the big symptoms that you have for astronauts who are going up into space is splitting migraines because you're having just everything is pushing up against your brain. And this is my favorite video is the pressure coming in and like literally squishing the back of your eyeballs. So you're seeing vision shifts that happen in astronauts that are going up into space because of these fluid shifts. In fact, the countermeasure right now for these vision shifts, they don't really know how to fix it. And so what they do is they just send all astronauts up with glasses with the expectation that their vision changes. In fact, I think Jessica Meir, who was up a couple years ago, she was the one person who went and flew up and had glasses when she flew up, and then her eyeball squished with the microgravity exposure, and now no longer has to wear glasses. So gravity worked in her favor. I think she's maybe the one person that it did. Okay, so then the next hazard we have here is isolation and confinement. So deep space travel and extended habitation, whether we're talking on the moon or we're talking on Mars, anywhere beyond Earth, is going to require astronauts to be isolated from their everyday communities and confined with their crewmates for prolonged periods. And likely it's going to be really, really small places. So we're talking, I think for Orion, which is the spacecraft that they're looking at for Mars, it is really small. I think you can put 4 people in there. It's like maybe the size of a New York studio. So like 350 square feet. It's very, very tiny. Now, studies indicate that isolation and confinement lead to declines in mood, in cognition, in morale, interpersonal interaction, as well as circadian rhythm dysfunction, nutritional deficiency, and immune dysregulation. It's further suggested that isolation and confinement can specifically impact neurological function, including hippocampal function and increased anxiety. Now, I think all of us very much understand how the deep impacts that isolation and confinement can have. We all saw how weird things got during COVID when we were isolated and confined, oftentimes to our much spacious houses, able to create COVID bubbles, etc. But we just heard a great talk, I believe it was last week, about the prison system. Like isolation and confinement does bad things to humans. Humans are not meant to live in those kinds of conditions at all. And it does weird things. Animal models, in fact, have further demonstrated that the confluence of this social isolation with other spaceflight hazards like weightlessness or radiation, which we'll talk about soon, can actually worsen effects. And it has these like combined effects that are really detrimental that no one really understands like what the fallout is going to actually be. So the next thing we have is hostile enclosed environments. So currently all human spaceflight environments require a closed loop controlled system. So whether it's a spacecraft or a habitat system, and if not properly designed, maintained, and operated, this can produce a biologically hostile environment. So those of you who are familiar with, oh gosh, I am blanking on the name, but it was in Arizona, and it was Biosphere and Biosphere 2, which like totally fell apart in the 1970s and created like all sorts of things. Like when humans are trying to create ecosystems and like don't have it figured out, like it can quite literally kill the humans. The controlled ecosystem requires design choices and trade-offs on temperature, on atmospheric composition and pressure, on lighting and noise. All that will apply to all of the crew members. So it's not like you can be personalized because everyone has to live there together, regardless of individual variation and preferences. So the system may be further continuously monitored for temperature, air quality, microbial, microbial contaminants, pressure, lighting, and noise. And due to engineering limitations and limited efficacy in air recycling systems, elevated carbon dioxide is actually a huge problem and can lead to hypoxic and hypocapnic responses and significant physiological, behavioral, and mood deficits. So if anyone has read Scott Kelly's biography, he talks a lot about carbon dioxide and how it just makes you feel crazy and makes you really, really angry, which is not what you want when you're in a tiny spacecraft trapped with like 3 other crewmates and just all of you. So the constant noise, the high carbon dioxide levels, the limited microorganism ecosystems all can impair cardiovascular function, sleep, immune function, cognitive function, and more. And prolonged confinement to this closed loop, artificially maintained ecosystem likely reduces the variability in environmental microbiomes. And so the magnitude of the microbiome is totally unknown. There's a lot of really exciting work that's being done on microbiome. I know Kyle just gave a great presentation a couple of weeks ago about his work with the microbiome. It is the Wild West. So you're talking like 2 Wild Wests meeting each other, microbiome, spaceflight, and no one really has any idea what's about to happen. And then we have space radiation. So space radiation is complicated. When you leave the protection of Earth's atmosphere and Earth's magnetic field, astronauts are encountering a more severe space radiation environment. The space radiation environment contains energetic solar particles, electrons and positrons, protons, helium nuclei, and heavier ions. So these are like high energy and high energy, high charge particles. They're also called like HZE particles. And they originate from solar flares, coronal mass ejections, galactic cosmic rays. And they have just substantial impacts on biological systems, and they're all happening at different rates. Now, right now, the biggest opportunity for protection, like how can you actually protect against radiation? It has to be engineering of spacecrafts and habitats. And like, how do you build a spacecraft that has an effective radiation shield? But the health effects of chronic exposure to all of these different things, whether it's galactic cosmic rays or high energy particles, it's of particular concern because of their high ionizing nature, high penetrability, high energy deposition. And, you know, when you're outside of Earth's atmosphere, you are likely receiving substantially greater radiation doses. It is not ethical to test this on humans, obviously. We can look at it in animal models. There's a lot of really great work that's being done on animal models, and we can look at populations that have been unfortunately exposed already. But we're talking chronic exposure. We're talking like galactic exposure. And so there's really only a handful of guesses as to what is going to happen and what the appropriate limits are. We know that it is very, very bad for humans, damaged central nervous system, altered cognitive function, reduced motor function, behavioral changes. We see things like mitochondrial dysregulation, oxidative stress, that leads to spaceflight related dysregulation of like every system. So cardiovascular, immune, neurological, metabolic systems. But it's interesting because in the radiation spaceflight community, they're like, this is really, really bad, and we don't really know what's going on. And in fact, there was a panel with some like really high-ranking NASA, the radiation, like NASA human radiation experts, and they were like, we have not even made that much progress in understanding what's happening to human radiation in the past 20 years because it's so complicated, and trying to figure out countermeasures is just really, really hard. There are another group of people who would argue, who cares about radiation because we still haven't figured out how to feed people long enough to then be impacted by radiation to then have negative effects. Like they'll probably die of starvation before they'll die of radiation. And so just a view into the trade-offs and the risks that people have to deal with. But our understanding of radiation is really honestly quite limited. And then the final hazard that they define is distance from Earth. And distance from Earth is, I think, equivalent to distance from home, however you define home to be. So future space flights will all entail greater distances from Earth. Radio communication in spaceflight missions is subject to significant delays due to the finite speed of light. Like light can only move so fast, and sound, if you're using radio, can only move so fast. So on the International Space Station, which is orbiting the Earth, the International Space Station, I think, is like closer from the surface to where it is like in orbit than like New York to Texas. So it's not actually that far from Earth. And so at its closest approach, it's 0.001 to a 2-second time delay. Now, with the moon, it's a 1.3 second time delay. But Mars, you're seeing a delay of up to 20 minutes each way. So that's like if you call and you're like, we have a medical emergency, we need to deal with something right now. And then it will take 20 minutes for them to receive that message, to then send you a message back, and then 20 minutes for it to come back to you. And that makes it very difficult to deal with very urgent problems. The literal distance, cost, and difficulty in returning to Earth in an emergency means that there are limited to no opportunities to provide crews with additional supplies once their mission has started. The combination of communication delays and hamstring resupply also constrains medical treatment options and other equipment capabilities, and removes the option of rapid evacuation or immediate rescue for any other mission beyond low Earth orbit. Now, with this limited to no resupply, pharmaceutical shelf life also becomes, and safety of pharmaceutical consumption becomes a huge issue. Like, can you have a medication that has been sitting for a very, very long time? Has it been impacted by radiation? Has it been impacted by the hostile environment? There's like weird microbes, and can that change your pharmaceuticals? But also the psychological distress of being distant from Earth and all that it represents, whether it's access to help or like being close to your friends and family, or like trees. The amount of times that you hear astronauts who are like, I just want to be around something green. Show me a tree, show me a plant. And it can have substantial impacts on crew dynamics, both increasing dependencies and feelings of closeness among crews, but also exacerbating interpersonal responses and interpersonal issues. So there's a ton of research out there that is being done to look at some of these pressing issues. Like we see things like autonomous health support for flight medical officers, health monitoring and wearable sensors, AI-assisted medical diagnoses. Like there are all these, like, we can do it VR, we can have like a little robot that can like tell you what to do. Onboard genetics and sequencing capacities, health risk prediction models. So there's a lot of things that people are trying to do to kind of get away from having to be so reliant and dependent on Earth, but it's still a work in progress. Now, I would say that with the exception of altered gravity fields on Earth, everything is basically 1G, and space radiation, we're seeing hazards that are shared with other harsh and unpredictable environments that we experience here on Earth. So this, I think, is just like a very cool, graph that talks about if you were to do no countermeasures. So we're talking like no exercise, no pharmaceutical treatments. You're just like letting people float as is. You can see all the different things that happen and at what time scales. So we had talked about earlier about how acclimatization and adaptation, it changes depending on how much time you have exposed. So you have like, if you're going on a 2-week mission or a 3-day mission, it's very different than going on 6 months or 1 year. And, so it's hard to necessarily model out when the changes for every different system changes at different time points. Okay, so let's talk about how NASA specifically is approaching these questions. So I think it's helpful to remember that NASA is an engineering program. So even the human research program is at heart an engineering body that is then a government entity. And the primary way of addressing how to tackle unknowns in spaceflight is to use existing evidence to identify risks and then gaps and then tasks and then deliverables, which then tell you back what your evidence is. So what are some of these identified risks? We have a whole list here. We can see things like cognitive and behavioral conditions, team performance decrements, an altered immune system. Now, we as researchers, people who are working in these areas, know that all of these different things are going to be interconnected with each other. Functionally, they are deeply interconnected, and we need to be able to think across these different sectors. But there needs to be a way to create the frameworks for how these things relate to each other, and not just for understanding the systems theoretically. Like, yes, it would be great to know intellectually, like how the immune system and how cognitive function are related to each other, or how immune system and MT performance. But we also need to be able to look at that theoretical, like the theoretical framework that we can then fit this data in, and then how that is related operationally, because that's what NASA actually cares about. So when we're thinking about setting up the scaffolding and the infrastructure of space health and space medicine, we need to be able to make that transition, because what NASA cares about is what is the bare minimum? What do we need to do to keep people alive, or at least alive long enough to finish the mission successfully? So this is the actual operational document. I try not to show it because it's very scary and there are a lot of colors, but you can see how it's viewed, where it's like there are things that you have to figure out immediately, otherwise people will die. And then you have things that you're like, okay, you can figure out, people will probably get really sick and this is not ideal or optimal for the success of the mission. And then things that are like, well, like we should figure it out, but like maybe it's not going to be the end of the world. So for example, like host microbiome interactions, like, yeah, this is probably an issue, but like if we can't figure it out, like, I don't know, what's the worst that can happen? Where something like team performance decrements, if we don't figure a way how to get people to get along, they will kill each other, and that is really bad for the mission that we're trying to do. So I think it's really helpful for us as researchers, as scientists, to understand what we're walking ourselves into. And I would argue that placing these systems, so placing all of these questions into an evolutionary framework to better understand adaptation, to understand acclimatization, is going to help us make better operational decisions, because we have an understanding of how these different things are related to each other, what things are more important than others. So instead of looking at these changes that are happening in response to the 5 hazards, all of these different things in isolation, so like just looking at the brain or just looking at cardiovascular system or bone and muscle, we can think about how these things are connected through various feedback loops. And this goes back to like our evolutionary standpoint and how we're thinking about acclimatization and adaptation. So working in the spaceflight world, there is a slow shift in the thinking to embrace this kinds of integrative perspective. But as we're building the foundation for this space health system, which will be the next public health system, we need to actively pursue these kinds of integrative, complex systems thinking. So I want to just switch gears a little bit for the last bit of time that I have left, talk about what I think we should be considering in our, when we're thinking about our futures here. So doing the science of understanding how to keep humans alive in space it's really cool. Like, I feel like I have mad street cred because I work in spaceflight and I think it's awesome, but it has much larger implications. So this painting, I don't know if people recognize it. The style is really distinct. It's actually by the artist Amy Sherald, who also did Michelle Obama's First Lady official portrait in the National Portrait Gallery. I think it's on tour right now if anyone wants to see it. But I love this painting. This was actually in my local art museum, the Baltimore Museum of Art, very recently, and I just stumbled upon it. I thought it was just incredible. But I think what it does is it accurately captures the wonder that spaceflight can inspire, but also the turned figure on the right stares directly at the viewer and seems to ask, is this for me? Now, the spaceflight world is something that can be of joy and inspiration and going farther than one has ever gone before. But who actually gets to do spaceflight? Now, in the past 5 years, in particular, commercial spaceflight has really taken off. You see the headlines of SpaceX, of Blue Origin. All it seems like every billionaire has their own like pocket spaceflight company, and it's exponentially speeding up the process of having everyday people living and working in space. Now, setting up an equitable health and medicine infrastructure for the public in the spaceflight arena is an urgent task. If it is not done now, we are going to be replicating the same errors and the inequities that we have in our current systems. Now, I'm not going to talk about the history of spaceflight. We can talk about it later if anyone is interested. But like we all know, it has these like deep Cold War origins, and social who's trying to get political power. And like many other fields, historically, human spaceflight, both the researchers and the subjects, have been largely dominated by white men and their perspectives on what is an ideal human body, who gets to fly, what kind of variation is normal, and what variation is aberrant or pathological. Now, as anthropologists, we are like very much in this discussion of like, what does it mean to decolonize our work? What does it mean to decolonize biology, to decolonize human biology and human variation? And we have the opportunity to translate this into this very nascent field. So this includes questions of, who is asking the questions and what those questions actually are. So we saw this potential future earlier. Now this, I don't know if anyone recognized this picture. This was actually just from a couple of months ago, maybe a couple of weeks ago. This is our climate present. This picture was from New York City during the Canadian wildfires. This was like, honestly, Baltimore was the same. It was like, this is what outside my house looked like. It was terrifying. And we joke about living in a dystopian reality, but the futures that we imagine for some distant world, distance and time and in space, are the same structures that we build in our own realities. So I talked earlier about how it is very rare to find a single person by themselves. When you're talking about humans, you always have to consider them in groups of other people. You have this person in an energetically demanding environment, experiencing these potent stressors, and they're likely going to be surrounded by groups of other people. And these people that they're surrounded with have their own interacting physiological and behavioral systems. And these individuals are all socially connected to each other in unique but potentially important ways. Now, there are lots of different, maybe complex ways that these interconnected physiological and socially related behavioral dynamics can affect the individual, particularly in an extreme environment. But when we're thinking about human biobehavioral response to these crazy, harsh, and unpredictable extremes, thinking about how humans are interrelated with one another and the positive and negative impacts that we have on each other in these challenging economies or ecologies is the way forward. So when we're here is where we're building protected structures of social support that are specific to the needs of different extreme environments from the ground up can have really major impacts. So whether it is pandemic preparedness, global climate crises, or the new space health ecosystem, translating research to operations, as it's called in the human spaceflight setting, or public health, global health infrastructures. But we can use these integrated evolutionary perspectives to maybe build a better world. So if you're interested in reading more about this, this is actually coming out of this really fantastic special issue that I had put together with Dr. Alexander Neclue. Dr. Kim is actually featured in it as well. There's an article that's under review right now at the American Journal of Human Biology about the human biology of spaceflight. A lot of thoughts and ideas on how we can translate our work into making some real impacts on sociopolitical and economic health structures. And I'd like to thank my funders who have paid me for all of this, and we have time, I think, for Q&A.
Right. Well, thanks so much, Mallika, for a fantastic talk. Probably like 3 talks in one. Really appreciate it. Cool. Want to just open the floor for any questions that people may have. I have one I actually wanted to start with that came all the way from the beginning of your talk. So you talked about this like axis of unpredictability and harshness. I'm curious about your how you see time factoring into this, and also like the application of this model to like producing testable hypotheses for like space health, like health and biology in space contexts.
So that's a great question. And it's a great question because I myself have been grappling with it ever since I kind of picked up on it. So, um, you know, I think familiar to some people here, maybe less. If those of you who are from the like Northwestern spawn contingent, a lot of our work has come out of this developmental plasticity literature, and that's where my early work started as well, is looking at um, infant responses and like the neuroendocrine system and the importance of harshness and unpredictability in shaping developmental trajectories and developmental pathways. And when I started moving into extreme environments, of course, like those theoretical frameworks kind of stuck with me. And I'm like, this is actually a really good way of looking at extremes because, you know, we're not necessarily looking at, is your dad going to be around to provide, or is your mother able to like have the energetic resources, but like the environment itself can it actually be placing that stressor. Now, I think that creating a matrix that is then like broadly usable and testable is really important, but also very tricky. And I think is probably going to be something I'm going to be working on for like the next 15 years, probably, as I'm trying to figure out how to actually make it testable. To answer your first question for time, I think time is a z-axis. So I think that there's like harshness and unpredictability, and then time is a z-axis, and then things exist on time. Because like if we take like a really basic example of COVID, I think COVID's a great example because we all experienced it, right? So we are experiencing the COVID landscape, and you know, is it a 3-day thing? Is it a 3-month thing? Is it a 3-year thing? The level of harshness and unpredictability changes depending on what your time scale is. And also the impacts on your body are going to change depending on what that time scale is. If you are going on a 3-day excursion of high unpredictability or high unpredictableness, the submarine, okay, I don't know how many of you have been like very much following public news, common media. So the submarine, if you think you are only going to experience a harsh and unpredictable environment for what should be a handful of days, what is your capacity to deal with that? What is that impact going to have on you? Like regardless of like actual mortality impacts, but we're thinking about like longer term implications. And so I think that time has to exist on a z-axis. I had a really great conversation a couple months ago with Charlie Nunn at Duke about the same like harshness and unpredictability axis. And he thinks that there is a way to like quantify it to make it testable, like by like to make it into like an epidemiological model of harshness and unpredictability. Now, how to do that, I don't know yet. And so if anyone wants to collaborate, holler at me and we can do that because that would be awesome. But I think it's interesting because there's like so much fantastic work in the behavioral ecology literature, like specifically in like the primate literature that talks about harshness and unpredictability and like how reliable it is for like reproductive outcomes. And even in life history theory itself, like the early ideas of life history theory being strictly connected to reproductive outcomes and to like mortality, extrinsic mortality is maybe not how a lot of other people are using it. And like even in this context, that's how I'm using it. I'm thinking about it from ideas of behavior, risk, how it's shaping like longer term function. And so I think it's I don't know if that's like a very satisfying answer, but it is an ongoing conversation, and I am excited to talk more about it with other people who also think about these things so we can like write a couple papers together.
Cool. Thanks, Mallika. So Kayla had their hand up, and then Nerly, if you want to ask your question afterwards, that'd be great. Thanks. So Kayla.
Hi, Dr. Sarma. Thank you so much. That was an amazing talk. I actually don't know a lot about spaceflight, but one of the questions that was coming to my mind during the end is how is human diversity being factored into a lot of this research? Like you kind of were talking about how all of these biological systems are impacted by spaceflight, but then also we know like there's all this difference between people and like how one body actually might not respond the same as another body. And so I'm just very curious if there are like aspects of human diversity that are being, how they're being taken into account, how they're being thought of in the context of human space flight and yeah.
That's a Fantastic question. And the short answer is it's not. It's not. In fact, there are many times that I'm like, why am I even a researcher? I could just work at a coffee shop or be a beach bum and I'd be very happy. But then I think about this particular thing about how spaceflight is built, like the space medical risk and space health assumptions that are made are built on these historical ideas of the data that we currently have about humans in space, and they are, for the most part, overwhelmingly, I would say even like 90% on white men. And it's like not even different kinds of white men. It's like a very particular kind of white men. Like if you're looking at like lunar launches, like the lunar trips, we're talking like fighter pilots who have military backgrounds that are from generally the same reason. Apparently, a ton of astronauts from Ohio specifically. Even international representation is not that much. It is a very, very narrow group of people that have been studied, and these assumptions that are being made about space health and the that are being made about space health and the suggestions for space medicine are based on a very small sample size. And it is a huge problem. And there are people who are like, maybe we should be considering this, but then they're like, well, the pushback against that is there's such limited infrastructure, there's such limited resources, there are such limited, like chances to get data and who's going to get there, et cetera, et cetera. And so that's kind of the pushback, but that's why like we really, really need more and like more diverse people in the field itself who are able to talk about these things. Like the number of times that I've been in meetings where I'm like, okay, have we thought about that not actually working? Like that's not relevant to a whole group of other people. So there are some people who are kind of pushing back on that. The differently abled populations, I think, are probably one of the better represented. So in the like 60s, I want to say, they did a whole bunch of spaceflight specific testing. So like looking at putting people in centrifuges, et cetera, who were deaf, because they were like, if your vestibular system is not working in the same ways as someone who can hear, does that mean that you're like better equipped to be in a spaceflight setting? There's also the European Space Agency, ESA, actually just had a whole bunch of studies that were done on like differently abled astronauts, and included a differently abled like physical disability astronaut application, and they got someone who I think is like a Paralympian, so they're like insane to begin with. But it's so under researched, and it's a huge problem, and like why we desperately need more people to be in this industry, to be thinking about these things and talking about these things. So great question.
Thank you.
Nerly? Yeah.
Hi, Mallika. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, well, I just want to say that this was like an incredible talk. It's so interesting. I love like hearing you talk. Like I can tell that this is a topic that you really love and enjoy. So I wanted to ask if you would share with us like your journey on how you became interested in this specific research topic. And then the follow-up question is, what impacts do you think that this type of research will have for like present public health issues here on Earth? Thank you.
So I will be totally honest, maybe to my detriment, since I know this is being recorded. When I like had wanted to work in spaceflight like way before I wanted to be an anthropologist. Like I thought I was going to be an astrophysicist, and I wanted to work in space because it was cool. Like I'm not gonna lie, literally just because it was cool and I wanted to be really cool. And I was like, I'm gonna be like the coolest, I'm gonna be like the best. I'm wanted to be like a super high achiever, I wanted to be the best of the best and be an astronaut and do all of these things. And I like started my work in physics, and I was like, no, I hate this. I'm like in a dark room doing calculations and this is boring. And so I had switched from that to biology and psychology, and I found humans to be much more interesting. And when I first started, like both in undergraduate and graduate school, I still was like, I want to study like this very highly elite group of people because it's like the pinnacle of what humans can be. How cool is that? Like there's so much really important research, in-depth research on all the things that can go wrong with people, but how are these people exceptional? How does that happen? And I will say that like I kind of had like a big shift both. I would say like maybe in graduate school, but actually like during my postdoc when I was working in the spaceflight world, and the kind of the things that I was talking about with Kayla, like that has like really changed my perspective and like changed my trajectory of why I do this work. I think I would have probably, like, let's be real, COVID was hard for everyone. And I like finished my PhD in COVID and I was like, why am I doing this? Why am I even doing research? But realizing and recognizing how like limited the current research is and how really big decisions and assumptions are being made that are being made on such a small group of people, and it's not accounting for everyone else, and it's not accounting for, you know, how we can actually, like, it's not set yet. The infrastructure, the space flight medicine, the space medicine, space health infrastructure isn't set yet. There are things we can do to make it better than what we're experiencing on Earth. Like for those of us who live in the United States, our healthcare system is a dumpster fire. Like there's no other way to describe it. And we're then talking about putting people in an extreme austere setting and then replicating those same kinds of health systems. Like that is unsustainable. And you know, I've had talks where I've given and people are like, why are you even working in spaceflight? There's so many issues with climate change. There's so many issues like in our healthcare system. You know, spaceflight is for the billionaires. I'm like, okay, but if the billionaires are going to be building a space hotel, if they're going to be building tourism industries, whatever, who is going to build those things? They're going to be regular people. You're not going to have billionaires going and building those things. They're regular people. They're regular taxpayers in the United States, across the world. We owe it to them to make sure that whatever infrastructure that is being built next, because it's happening, whether we like it or not, it's happening. We owe it to everyone to make sure that it's like safe and healthy and equitable in the ways that we can. And maybe we can set up an infrastructure that is like, can then reflect back on Earth and be like, maybe this is how things should be back here. I know that there are people who, like a lot of people who are involved in the spaceflight world, whether it is like their crew or they've been in analog settings, once you've experienced that, when you come back to like the regular world, like you treat people differently because you realize how fragile our systems are and like how much we depend on each other and how much like social support matters and infrastructure matters. And so I know maybe it's a little like Pollyanna-esque and a little like we're trying to like save the world, but hopefully, I mean, that's why I'm still in the game. Otherwise, I would have been out of research a long time ago, but I'm in it because I feel like there's like a moral obligation to make sure that it's not the complete dumpster fire that it could be.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. Like, there's so many things I hadn't thought of. So yeah, thank you for sharing your perspective. I'm like so excited for your research and your work.
Thank you, Nerly.
Cool, thanks. Paula, if you're around, do you want to ask your question?
Sure. Hi, this was a wonderful way to spend a Monday afternoon. You got me so jazzed about research and everything. I really enjoyed this. I was wondering if you could speak to how social media and like new technology impacts social health, mental health, and like senses of community. I was thinking about your example about trees, and that really struck like me as something that we missed a lot during the pandemic, so I can't imagine. And then I don't know if this has an impact, but how does broader media about space, novels, books, TV shows, how does that play into it, especially when we're talking about like representation in these spaces? And yeah.
Great questions. Okay, so for like technology and health, I think it's a very exciting and emerging area. And I think this is an example actually of how like this kind of like space-like context can like troubleshoot and like test out things that can then like translate back to Earth in really exciting ways. So like if you only are with 5 people and you need more stimulation than that, I need more stimulation than that. I actually did a analog study last 21 where I did an isolation study where I was in a habitat with a team. It was like I was a commander of a team of 6, and it was just us on this like tiny habitat for a whole month. And I realized very quickly, I'm like, I need other kinds of stimulation. I cannot just depend on 5 people. This is where you can test things like apps where you can test like different processes of trying to improve mental health. There's some really cool stuff that's happening out there. There's like, I saw something that they're trying to create an AI system that replicates like a family member, like your mother or like a close relative, that can talk you through making difficult medical decisions, because then it's like someone that you trust. I don't know if it's like too uncanny valley. It's like, you look like my mom, but you're not my mom. And so like, how are we having this conversation? There's a lot of really cool stuff on VR. So you're like existing in a VR system and like you're in this world. So like if you're really like devoid of plants and trees, like not like being able to kind of see that space is really helpful. And then there's like a lot of like, you know, how much can social media, and how much can like technology do, and how much do you need the real stuff? Like, are plants good because you can see plants, or are plants good because you can like feel them, and you can feel the dirt, and you can feel the leaves, or you can smell them, and you can like the things that they do in the like to the air, like air filtration. And like, what are the trade-offs? What are the things that are going to be helpful? What are things that are not going to be helpful? I think that there is going to be a huge blow up in like technology innovations that are going to probably be used in like both spaceflight settings, but also probably on Earth settings. I think what it comes down to, and this is like from my other work in like social support area, like we just desperately need each other. Humans are very bad at being alone, and so we desperately need each other in whatever ways that we can. And the way, like, if we can find ways to be more engaged in social media, so like, you know, ways that we can actually talk and engage with each other, as opposed to like the Tinder model where you're just like kind of like swiping and evaluating, I think that's probably better for mental health. And I think that it actually goes into your second question about like popular representations and popular media about how we think about space, because I feel like speculative fiction is a really great way to imagine possible technological innovations. I think it has a huge part of it. Like, I don't think that people would want to be doing spaceflight if there wasn't so many great shows and great like movies about space. There's some like really horrible shows and movies about space, but there are also some great shows and movies about space. Like, there's so many people I know who are inspired by Star Trek, who are inspired by like, you know, Star Wars. My personal favorite is The Expanse. I love The Expanse. I always say that the season where they're on a new planet is like actually what my whole dissertation was about how like ecological and like you have ecological stressors, but then if everyone is trying to kill each other, who cares about the ecological stressors? Like, that is going to take more precedence. So I think that it's like a really fabulous tool to both understand and imagine like what our futures can be. But when you come down to it, all of these stories are like human stories that happen on Earth. They're just like in a different setting. So like the systems and structures that we set up in space in a spaceflight setting are just as relevant to things that we can set up here on Earth. And so like that's kind of like, you know, like what I like I have kind of continuously come back to is that, you know, you think about sci-fi, you think of like The Expanse, I think is a great example. Those are the same tensions and questions that people have back on Earth. And if you ever want to talk like, you know, space movies, just like hit me up. We'll talk about them forever.
Yeah, I'm gonna hit you up on like microbiome questions because that's what I study, but I just had this burning question about social media and media writ large. But thank you so much. This is so interesting.
Hi, Mallika. What a great segue. So my name is Flor Rios, and I'm an undergraduate here at UC Berkeley, and I actually study the connections between humans and plants. And I have a current project with NASA to
Amazing.
Yeah, thank you. To reinstitute, or actually to implement, not reinstitute, but implement, because it's never been done, indigenous food systems into the food processing going into space. So I would love to get your email and your thoughts on how nutrition and fresh crops sort of intersect with all of the human biology work that you've done.
Yeah, I would love to talk to you more about that. I put my email in the chat, and Dr. Kim also has my email. But the plant stuff is the coolest, and I like really, really want to do plant things and want to do like a combination of like plant, social support, mental health, like stress response in space. Not sure how we're going to do that yet, but I have some ideas, and we should totally talk because I think it would be awesome. And I can connect you with, I mean, it sounds like you already know people in the NASA sphere, but like the plant people who work at NASA are also like the nicest people, and they are the most fun people to hang out with. So I know them just because they're fun to hang out with at conferences. So maybe we'll see each other at one of the conferences and we can all party. It'll be great.
Hello. Thank you for your talk. I had a question. It was about the last part of your presentation.
Yes.
You compared a little bit about how, like with climate change, like increasing harshness and increasing unpredictability, like the challenges we're facing here are like kind of similar to like the challenges that people experience in spaceflight. Do you think that, like with that perspective in mind, do you think that there's a limit or an extent to humans' capability to survive and thrive, like on Earth?
Yes. Oh, 100%. I mean, we can survive and thrive up to a point and then we will die. Like, I think that has to be the, like, it has to be the outcome, because otherwise it's like, no, we can just keep going a little bit more. Actually, this goes back to Andy's point about time. Like, we can probably survive for short periods of time, but like heat. So, okay, California is probably not experiencing this right now, but if you're on the East Coast, there's like record heat waves happening right now, East Coast, Midwest, and then the South. We're like talking like 90, hundreds. That is like not normal for this time of year. It's like, you know, August is usually when this happens. And like, it's just, it's not sustainable. Like, yes, we can come up with short-term solutions, but if we're thinking from like a larger evolutionary perspective and like population survival, like, no, like, humans are not good in the heat. We can adapt for a little bit, and then we start, you know, falling off. And I think that is where like the spaceflight as kind of like a model to then translate back to climate change is actually really good, because the parameters in spaceflight are really clear. Like, you cannot go outside your spacecraft without a suit because you will die. You cannot change the air composition of the spacecraft, otherwise you will die. You cannot like be exposed, like raw exposure to radiation, you will die. So like understanding where those parameters are and like how far we can get and how like expansive we can get within those parameters is something we can do in a spaceflight setting, because those parameters are so clear. But in climate change, we don't actually know, we don't even know what we're coming up against. And so if we can then replicate those models of like, okay, this is how we can maximize our, you know, ability to do well, then maybe we're not pushing against those boundaries in a way where we're like, okay, well, now we just had like 500 people die from this one particular thing. So we know that that's it. That's our limit there. And so hopefully it'll maybe like save people's lives. I don't know. That is the hope. That is our naive hope that we're hopefully going to try and make things better. But that's a really good way of thinking about it. And I will keep that in mind for my future work, because I really like that.
Thank you.
Alrighty, so thanks so much, Mallika, Dr. Sarma. We are at the end of our time, so we really appreciate you giving this wonderful talk. And no, I know I'm not alone, that everyone is really just blown away by the breadth of work that you've been doing. So yeah, really appreciate it. And I'm gonna give me a quick second. Yeah, but we thank you so much for your contribution, and we look forward to your work.
Thank you so much for having me.